All right, hello and welcome to a very exciting CIVME webinar. We're really excited about this webinar tonight, and I'll talk a little bit about why we're excited in just a few moments, but I want to give people a chance late on this Sunday night to join us and have a little chat about lesson study. If as you're joining us, you can find the chat and tell us where you're joining us from. Just tell us your name and maybe your role and where you are so that we have a good idea of who we're talking to. And if you are joining us after the fact, if you're not joining us live on a Sunday night or on some later Sunday night, we'd love for you to just share out your experience watching this webinar and learning more about lesson study on social media. You can find us at CIVME app pretty much anywhere that you would look for something like that, and feel free to just give us a shout out there. We're really excited to get started. We're going to give it about a minute for everyone to get in, and then we will get going. So Rachel, we're excited to have you. Enjoy. Great to have you today. Joe, sorry. And we'll get started. If anybody else is joining and adds their name in, we'd love to enjoy the chat. So this is going to be a super informal conversation. I'm going to talk a little bit about why I'm so excited about this now, and then I will let Angela introduce herself. So the reason I'm really excited about this webinar is that in addition to being sort of what we typically do, we do these monthly webinars where we talk with experts in the field about ways in which you can help to improve teaching and learning in classrooms. We also, in addition to this, are releasing a brand new resource that we just released earlier today, which is a course that you can take at the new learn.civme.com, which I'll put into the chat. But this exciting new course is the first of what will eventually be 30 different courses that are available for free that can help you figure out how video and virtual learning environments can play a role in a variety of different professional development strategies. So we're starting today with lesson study, but if you can think of a PD movement or PD strategy out there, I bet there's a course coming in the next few weeks and months that will be there for you. I'll talk a little bit more about learn.civme.com and about this particular course later on, but in the meantime, I want to introduce Angela Rowe, who wrote this course, and who is the other reason I'm excited about having her here is that in addition to writing this course and working in schools, Angela is also a virtual coach for CIVME Virtual Coaching. So a big intersection of all the different things that CIVME does here on a Sunday night. So I'm really excited to have that happen. So Angela, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll start talking about lesson study.
All right. Well, good evening, Rachel and Joe. It's really nice to have you guys here. I'm so excited to talk about the lesson study course that I wrote. Just a little background about me. I've been in the field of education for going on 10 years now, but the past 5 years, I've really been working as an instructional coach, both in my district and then for the past year as a virtual coach. I'm currently working on my PhD in curriculum design and instruction with a focus on professional development for new teachers and veteran teachers, focusing on literacy practices and professional development. So this lesson study course, as well as the other things that CIVME is doing, fits right in line with my professional goals myself. So it's really exciting to be able to share this with you today.
Wonderful, and I'm excited to have you as an expert, like I said, in so many different capacities, both as a content writer creating this great course, but also supporting schools through the CIVME platform as a virtual coach. If you'd like to learn more about that or anything else that CIVME does, feel free to find us at civme.com, and we'll be happy to talk more about that. But Angela, let's get started with this conversation about lesson study. So tell us about your sort of how you got to know about lesson study. What's the background of it? What's the theory behind it? Where did it come from?
For me personally, I started looking at lesson study as a way to implement a different type of professional development in my own school building. Too many times, and we've talked about this through the CIVME platform and stuff, too many times it's the sit and get professional development, in my own school, we're trying to move away from that. So I had a personal connection with lesson study because I wanted to find that alternative approach. So I really started looking at the history of professional development in the United States. And I read a book called The Teaching Gap. And within this book, the authors compared the United States professional development to other countries around the world. And they found that lesson study is a core professional development that does help many teachers across state lines, basically, is how I can kind of compare it to. But it really originates out of Japan. So Japan utilizes lesson study as their go-to professional development, which is different than our go-to of sit and get professional development. So it originates in Japan, and it's all about teachers collaborating together on a research question. So teachers design and implement lesson plans centered on a research theme or question that they want to work on in their own classrooms. And it's all about collaboratively working together on this question and finding improvements to their teaching methods. So instead of having the broad professional development that we're used to, they really hone in on the individual teachers and what they need to do to improve their own teaching practices. So it really originates from Japan, and then we took the idea back in the early 2000s as something that we could possibly implement in our own country. And so since then, you're seeing a surgence of it across state lines.
Yeah, and I know one of the things that we reference in the course is the Texas Lesson Study Project. I mean, we're a Texas company, right? And it's been something that has been explored. I think people are kind of dipping their toes in the water of lesson study here in Texas. I think it's been really deeply implemented in other parts of the country. I know Tennessee is really into it and some other places. But the idea that I want to revisit is that idea of the research question, because you nail on the head, and I think we could maybe delve into some examples or something. The idea of going deep rather than going broad. And so much of what we do in schools for professional development now is, hey, everybody, you know, we've got one day, and you're all going to come in and you're going to sit in the cafeteria, or we're going to meet for maybe, you know, one period every 6 weeks or something like that. So we don't have a lot of time, so we can't really get below the surface. So we're going to cover as much ground as we possibly can, which sometimes I remember feeling as a teacher in the classroom, it can feel a little bit like drinking from the fire hose, right? Like it's so much information and it's given to you in a manner that is just overwhelming and really too difficult to digest and actually measurably change what you're doing on a day-to-day implementation in the classroom. So how does this idea of diving deeply into one research question sort of solve that problem, or at least seek to address it?
Well, I think it solves the problem because it's really just looking at one thing, and it really focuses on student outcomes. And a lot of time professional development, like you said, there's so much, it gets away from you and you can't really get at the heart of how students are improving. So having this one research question lets the teacher focus on one core thing and then lets them turn their attention to the student outcomes. So I think the research and the student outcomes is what makes this more beneficial than the broad aspect of it.
Yeah, and so when you say student outcomes, you mean your student outcomes, right?
Correct.
It's about you know, the work of, before we go into any kind of learning a new strategy or learning a new way of delivering curriculum or finding some new solution, let's really figure out what the problem is.
Yes.
Dive deeply into some kind of student artifact, whether that be student work, whether that be behavioral data or something, but that you're using artifacts to identify what that research problem should be, right?
Correct.
Can you think of any examples of how you might do that with teachers to sort of get them to hone in on that research, figuring out which artifacts are the right ones to look at?
I think it comes down first, especially for teachers, to the standards, really digging into what the standards are asking the teachers to do. So if you start there, you can find kind of like the broad theme that you're looking at. And then when you narrow down to the standard, then you can see what artifacts you're already producing with that standard and then go from there. So I think you have to go from the big picture of what is the theme of my curriculum to narrowing it down to the specific standard that I want to address, and how do I typically assess my students' understanding. And then once you see what you typically do, you can go from there to kind of dig in deeper to best practices that you should be doing.
That's really interesting, because it's really that idea, again, of depth, right? Like,
Yes.
you're going several layers in. So you're starting with the surface, you're starting with maybe the curriculum, you're, like you said, you're starting with the standards, but then you're saying, okay, well, what is the artifact that connects to this standard?
Correct.
The reason I love that is it's putting the power of designing instruction back in the hands of the teacher, right? And I remember so much feeling frequently, here's the curriculum, go teach it, don't ask questions, right?
Correct. Yes.
This is really empowering teachers to understand with a great deal of depth what it is that they're teaching, and then also how their students are demonstrating mastery of those learning standards.
Yes. And I think by giving teachers a chance to really dig into it, it lets them take ownership of their teaching. It's not just me as the instructional coach saying, okay, you have to teach X, Y, and Z. It's really letting them take ownership of their students, like you said, and then their teaching methods.
So this is just the beginning, right? Like, it's a cycle. Lesson study is a cycle. So after we've gone through this research phase where we're going in and sort of identifying what we're going to explore collaboratively as a group, what's the next step?
The next step is, once you determine your research question or your problem, is to really dig into best practices. So you're still researching, but you're really looking in at what others have done, what research shows works for your problem of practice or your research question, and coming up with 1 or 2 strategies for you to implement into your classroom. And then as a team, you're creating a lesson centered around that one strategy or that one best practice that aligns to your research question.
And how does that co-planning take place? Like, what is there a process, or is it sort of each school figures out for themselves, or each team of teachers figures out for themselves how they're going to do that co-planning?
I think that's the flexibility of lesson study. I think video, for one, is key for this, especially with schools that don't have a lot of money to hire substitutes or to pay teachers after hours to come together. So I think video is one way for teachers to come together to collaboratively plan. I also think it takes collaboratively planning and finding that time. So it really depends on the school. I know for my personal school, we use title funding to give teachers that opportunity to come together outside of their normal hours to collaborate. But we also use video as a way for webinars and for them to communicate virtually at home to plan their lesson.
Yeah, I remember the very first time that I read about lesson study, it was a book that came out probably about 10 years ago. And I can't remember the author of it, but the title of the book is Build a Better Teacher, and the A has a plus.
Yes.
And the author of that book, and it was sort of, like pop journalism, so it wasn't at all research-based or anything, but she was talking about how, in Japan, teachers are spending a tremendous amount of time, and then she also references the school at University of Michigan that's connected to University of Michigan, whatever Paul has, that where they're working so deeply and collaboratively on a day-to-day basis to do these things. So they're co-planning on a day-to-day basis. They're watching one another teach regularly and ongoing. So it's really embedded in the culture of the school. And I think the reason that appealed to me is I was always really lucky when I was a teacher in a classroom to always co-teach. I always had at least one other teacher in the room with me. Usually I had 2. So there were 3 of us, and we were always doing that sort of, I think, just organically, right? I think teachers naturally gravitate towards this idea of, hey, let's collaborate, let's work together, let's figure out how to reach these kids the best. And 3 sets of eyes is going to be way better than 1 set of eyes. I was in a minority as a teacher, right? There aren't a lot of teachers who have that opportunity. And so you've referenced the idea that maybe video might be a way to address that. But how do you see that being, how do you see technology making this a more regularly available part of the process?
I think it's going to help, like I said, with schools who don't have the means to have co-teaching in the same room because of finances and substitutes. So I think video is going to allow teachers that opportunity to watch each other and then plan with each other to prepare for a lesson to where they hopefully can co-teach together. So I think video is going to do a lot of the upfront work maybe to get teachers planning and then watching each other before they can get into with each other to co-teach, because a lot of schools don't have that ability. So I think they have to use video in a creative way to where they can be in each other's classrooms at the same time without physically being in each other's classroom. And video is going to help teachers do that.
And so the video is one of the pieces of artifacts. So now you're starting to put together this portfolio of artifacts all around this central research question, right?
Correct.
With maybe student artifacts, and now you're bringing in the classroom itself. But this is, again, like I mentioned, a cycle, right? So once that's happened, what happens next? We're getting back to the kind of the top of the circle, and what's happening then?
Okay, so once you implement the lesson, you're watching each other, you're going into each other's classrooms virtually to see the lesson. The key thing is to reflect on it. You don't want to just watch, I don't want to just watch your lesson and be like, okay, I'm done with this. I want to sit down either with you or virtually and go through the lesson and reflect on it using guiding questions to kind of guide you in the reflection process to see if there's any refinements I need to make or that you need to make. I think reflection is key to make sure you've thoroughly addressed the research question and to see if it worked. Did we get the student outcomes that we wanted when we came up with the lesson? So I think reflection would be the next step before we come back around.
Do you have any advice for that during that reflection phase, how these teams can sort of, you mentioned guiding questions. What do you think are the things that these reflections should be about?
I think when you're looking at reflection questions for this particular professional development, you want to look at teacher behaviors and student behaviors. What do you see the teacher doing? What teaching methods are they utilizing? And then what are the students doing? How are they responding? What are their artifacts? What does that look like? But I think if you just have 2 or 3 guiding questions focusing on the teacher and the student, you can really hone in on what the lesson is trying to do.
And that's interesting. So Joe asked the question,
oh, yeah.
Are they the same guiding questions for each lesson, or do you tailor the guiding questions maybe for each subsequent lesson that happens throughout this cycle?
I think you can have the overall general question of looking at the teacher and student behaviors, but you do want to have it in conjunction with what the lesson is supposed to be. So if you're doing a lesson on conceptual math or learning how to add and subtract conceptually, you would want your guiding questions to align to that, but with using that student behavior and teacher behavior as like the umbrella to it.
So this cycle, there's sort of, it's broken down, and I'll show it in a second in the course of the Texas Lesson Study Project. It's broken down into more steps than this, but it's essentially 3 big chunks: plan, observe, and reflect. And then reflect informs the next stage of plan. Do you have any thoughts or any of the research that you've done on the sort of the calendar for this? Like, how long should this take? How frequently should it happen? Any ideas on how that should work?
I think initially it's going to take some time to really set up and dig into it. But research shows that the more you're doing it, the more it becomes part of the culture. So initially you may need to spend a little extra time really digging into the research and the best practices and coming together as a team and just finding those, the comfort level with everyone and all the members of the team. So it could take you a week or 2 to really plan out the lesson, depending on how much time you dedicate to it. But after a while, it should become an ongoing part of your professional development practices. I know that what we're trying to do in my building is to spend some of our required professional development time where we're supposed to meet weekly to give teachers that opportunity to use that time to work on their problems of practice or their research question. And then so the more they do it, our goal is to have them where it's just part of their normal collaborative planning, because they get that They just don't know necessarily how to effectively do that. So we're hoping that the lesson study kind of bridges into that.
So dive deeply into that. What do you mean they get that, but they're still trying to figure out what are some of the maybe pitfalls that you've seen that maybe people could either anticipate or at least kind of help teachers navigate as they go through this idea of developing a problem practice?
I think the big thing is understanding, honing in on one research question. I think teachers see all the standards that they have to do within just a day, really, everything that they have to do, and they're not really sure where to begin with it, because here we are as professional development leaders giving them all this information. So really, it has to change on our end too as instructional leaders. Instead of giving them this wealth of information, we need to show them how to narrow down their focus. And it all comes down to, like I said at the beginning, the standard and the student outcomes. So giving teachers that time to practice just looking at one standard, one artifact, and going from there, instead of just saying, okay, here's your 5 standards for the week. Go for it. Go plan together on your planning time. Like, we have to show them, and we have to model as instructional leaders how to do that so that they can start doing it on their own.
And do you feel like there's been some opportunities for you to sort of have to redirect as people get, because I remember sort of being in that almost like a triage mentality where I'm like, this is the thing that has to be fixed. Throw everything else out the window. And that can be tempting in a classroom. Do you feel like you need to redirect teachers as keep them focused, I guess, a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's part of my core job as an instructional coach, as well as my administrators, to kind of get them back on the path. But I think one thing that helps them is seeing it in action. Those video reflections and them seeing their teaching in action helps narrow that focus for them. Because until they start watching themselves and watching their student behaviors, you're right. They're like, oh, the data, I got to move on to the next thing. But when they can see, okay, right there, my method there, now I understand where the data maybe is not what I wanted it, because they could visually see what was happening. So I think it comes back to the videoing and really giving teachers that opportunity to reflect on what they're doing in the classroom. I think that helps narrow their focus a little.
It's interesting. And I think, again, something that a lot of great teachers do intuitively, I mean, I wasn't one of them, but one of the things that I used to do was I had a folder that I would keep on my desktop of my computer that was titled "Next Year Do This Better." Because
Correct.
After the first couple of years, that teaching can be very much like the Greek mythology story of Sisyphus, where you're pushing the rock up the hill and then the rock just rolls back down you in May. And then you start back in August pushing that rock up the hill. And I was like, I got to figure out a way to remember in September of next year what it was like to be in September of this year, so I can do these things better. And this is really, I think, maybe shortening that time span, so that you're in week 1, you're saying, okay, well, what did I do in week 1 and how can that improve week 2? And that just kind of continuous cycle of inquiry.
Yes.
So I'm going to share my screen maybe so that we can talk a little bit about, because one of the things that, wait a minute, hold on, John. Research study showed that a high percentage of P12 teachers don't look at their state standards for students. Instead, they use the objectives in their textbooks. How do you train people to let go of the printed objectives and get into lesson study? That's a good question.
I can tell you what we do. We focus on, as the instructional team in my building, which is me and my administrators, we kind of take the textbooks out of their hands during the planning process and really hone in on the state standards. So I think that comes down to the instructional team and the culture of the school. So we, I don't want to say force, but we take it out of their hands to where they can't go to that when we're doing our initial planning. And all of our weekly planning, when we're in there with them, we're focused on what the state standard is saying, not what their textbooks are saying. Obviously, they use them and they're utilizing it within their classroom, but we set the precedent that this is kind of the focus, and it goes back to us as the instructional team modeling that for our teachers.
Yeah, I'll tell you, it's very enlightening to do that. I was working with a team of teachers a few years back where I did that with the state standards, and And going back again to just like to reiterate the idea of using student evidence. What would a student do to demonstrate mastery of this particular standard? How would you know that a kid learned it?
Correct.
Thumbs up, thumbs down is not sufficient, right? And you learn a lot from a teacher's reflection on that question. Just that simple question, how would you know that a kid knew what this standard was, knew and was ready to move on, was ready to demonstrate mastery of it? Really shows you, I think you put 3 or 5 teachers in a room, you're going to get at least 3 answers, right? They're going to have different responses to that.
Correct.
In and of itself is a great learning opportunity for those teachers, right? Which gets me to my last question before I start sharing, which is the size, sort of like what's the group size? You know, how would you think about grouping teachers for this kind of activity? And is there a size that's too big? Is there a size that's too small?
I would personally keep it around, and research shows you want to keep it around 3 to 5 teachers. That can include 2 teachers and a coach. That could include 3 teachers and an administrator. It really just depends, but you want to keep the sample size 3 to 5 teachers at a time.
And is there a point at which this is, I mean, it seems to me like, at least from the stories that I've read about it, like the ultimate goal of this is teacher autonomy, right? Like this,
Correct.
That this team of people is really doing this work on their own without the intervention of some kind of leader or something. And then really at that point, the leader steps in and just sort of acts as an occasional guide. But that it's teacher-driven PD, right?
It absolutely, yes.
Is there a process for getting to that? Because I don't think it happens right at first, right?
It does not happen right away. And that's why I was saying you want to start off with a coach or with your administrators in that core group, especially as you're getting it going. But you're right. After a while, the goal is that they're doing it on their own and the instructional team is coming in to help refine if they need that help, but they're taking that initiative. But you can't just expect them to do that without you getting in the mud with them and doing it with them. They need to see you as an instructional leader as well and not feel like they're the only ones trying to figure out the idea on their own. They need your support at first.
And it's just like we talk about good instruction in the classroom.
Yes.
Like you as a leader go from being the sage on the stage to the guide on the side, right? You're doing the same thing that we're asking teachers to do in classrooms, which
Correct.
is no longer stand up at the front of the room and write on the board and lecture, but rather allow students to go through this active discovery themselves as well. So we're doing that with this as well. So keep asking questions. If you've got more questions or more thoughts that you want to ask about, we will definitely dive into them. But I do want to take a moment just to show you, if you really want to get deeply into this, and maybe you want to get started doing this tomorrow with with the teachers that you support or the schools that you work with, you can go right now and sign up to take this course at learn.sibme.com. Like I said, it is the first of many, many courses that we're going to be offering over the next several months. So if you go to learn.sibme.com and you go through the lesson study course, you're like, yeah, this is really good. This is going to work with this group of teachers, but I need something else for this group. Maybe you're really into instructional coaching, direct one-on-one coaching, or maybe you want to do collaborative teams where pairs of teachers are working together. Maybe you're really into PLC. Then I'll plug the course I wrote. Maybe you're really into new teachers. And those will all be coming out in the next few months. But you see right here, the second course right here that's available is Lesson Study. You'll see that this is free, just like everything else available on this site. And it has lots of great resources in it. And I'm going to just go quickly a couple of them to just talk about them with Angela. But the course basically breaks up into the same categories that we've talked about tonight, right? What's the background of lesson study? Why is video helpful within the course of lesson study? And then how do I do it? And it's the how do I do it, these 9 things that are here that I'm going to jump to now because I think that there's some really good fodder for conversation. And just the thing that just jumped out at me was this activity, deepening the awareness and understanding of lesson study. Because you referenced this, for this group of teachers, the video of the students in the classroom can in and of itself be really, really valuable for this process. But also, this activity that you recommend is essentially record the whole process so that
Yes.
you're capturing the meetings, you're capturing those cycles of inquiry and all that sort of stuff so that people are able to really down the road learn from the development of that process. So the other activity that I was going to look at, so there's this one, but the other one that I was going to look at is this idea of coding and counting the evidence. And you said this where you're looking at student activities versus teacher activities, or not versus, but you're sort of segregating, what is the teacher doing? What are the students doing? That's one way in which you might do this.
Yes.
One of the challenges that we see a lot with schools is the very first time that a teacher starts to view video of themselves or of other people, because a classroom is such a complex, dynamic environment, it, again, is that drinking from a fire hose. It's just so much to watch. So do you have advice on how people can sort of hone in, maybe from your coach's perspective, how do you go into a classroom and really stay focused on that one thing?
It goes down, so if you're looking at this code and count evidence, it really comes down to finding one thing to look for, one or two things to look for in code. So when I go into a classroom, if I'm looking at, go back to the math analogy, how teachers are conceptually teaching adding and subtracting, I'm focusing on those specific strategies, not necessarily what Johnny is doing over here or what happens when the assistant walks in. I'm really just focusing on the strategy. On the other hand, if I'm going in for classroom management, I'm focusing on tallying how many students call out at a time. So it's going in with a purpose so that you're not getting overwhelmed with everything that it's happening. You're just honing in on one thing, you're coding it, and you're counting it as you reflect through.
And you bring up another activity that's in here, and again, one of the things that's really cool about this is, this is one activity, but it links to a lot of other resources. And there's one, I think it's this one, here, where we're linking to another resource that exists, some questions that you can use to begin the process of figuring out what it is that you're going to ask after the fact, and that can guide what it is that you watch as you go into the classroom. But it's about that idea of, don't just randomly record a video and put it into a collaboration huddle and say, hey, I'll take care of it. Look at this, and expect that to be lesson study, right? That's not lesson study. No. The central locus of focus is that research question that's based on some standard that you want to explore.
Absolutely.
So the last thing here that I wanted to just look at real quickly is, this is an example, and like I said, it's something that we started to, in the state of Texas, dip our toes into. We have no affiliation with the Texas Lesson Study Project, so I don't think that we're plugging it. But it is a great resource for people who are interested in looking into this. And then we also sort of look at how you might structure this within the CIVME platform. So if you are a CIVME user, you don't have to be a CIVME user to do this, and we talk about how you could do this just with a camera or a camera phone. But if you are using CIVME, this can really show you how to really do this easily and quickly, how to use the different features within the huddle. So you're not just sharing video, you're using the discussion feed to have these conversations back and forth. And then you're using the framework tags and those sorts of things to really code and count the evidence within a video so that you can see that data very quickly within the process. So, and then the last thing is using the video library to sort of share it out for everyone in your account to see. But I bring this up because I was talking to Angela about before the webinar. My mom, who was a retired teacher, and I were talking about this earlier, and she was asking me what I was doing on a Sunday night, and I was telling her, and she said, well, how would anybody ever do that? Because again, going back to, she was like, I never got to leave my classroom to go watch another teacher teach. So this is the answer. And I said, well, let me tell you about this great product called SIVME. This is the opportunity to make this happen in a blended environment. But my question to you, Angela, and this is sort of my final question for the night, is sort of, is this entirely a virtual experience, or do you still see that there's value in teachers sitting in a room and talking to one another in a face-to-face environment?
I think absolutely you need to still sit in a room together and collaborate and still have those opportunities to go into the classroom so that you can see the big picture and not miss that one-on-one relationship building, really. Sometimes if it's all video, you kind of get disconnected. I think there needs to be a balance of both. I think you need to have those opportunities to get in there with each other, dig deep around a table, pulling out all your materials. But I also think there's a time and place to bring in the video component, especially if you don't have the time or the resources to do it every single day, like in a perfect world you would want to. So I definitely see value in doing it face-to-face as well.
Yeah, it's this moment right here, right?
Yes.
Those two arrows going back and forth between teach and observe and reflect and revise. Being able to do that with a great amount of frequency is something that technology can enable that you wouldn't feasibly be able to do enough with, even if you did have a pretty robust sub budget or something like that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Put people into the classroom. So that's really cool. So great. Well, so do you have any final thoughts? And if anybody has any final questions for Angela, I'd be happy to talk about them now. Any closing thoughts for us?
So my final thought is, I think lesson study is such a valuable tool for teachers to make it personalized, their professional development, to make it more personalized for themselves. And it gives them the opportunity to start bridging away from the sit and get. It's not the only professional development that they should be participating in. Like you said, we're going to have a ton of courses available for this, but I think it's such a valuable course because it lets teachers dig into their teaching methods and their students. And that's one of the reasons I promote this tremendously.
Well, and I mean, definitely, one of the reasons we wanted to do it so early on is it's really something that you want to get started at the beginning of the year. Don't wait for, if you're watching this in December, go ahead and do it. But for those of you who are wise enough to spend some time on an August afternoon with us, then, don't wait for later in the year to get started on this. Really take the time to try and figure out how to implement this as soon as possible. So I put the address. It's easy to remember, learn.sibme.com. If you are a SIVME user, you can access it directly from the SIVME page. You can just log into SIVME and you'll see the Learn link right there on the homepage. But just a quick caveat for people who are SIVME users. Right now, you do have to create a separate login because it's not something that we charge for. It's something that's free. We didn't want to limit it to only SIVME users to be able to access these resources. If that is not the thing for you, or if you're an individual teacher who's watching this and you're like, yeah, I'd love to do this, but I don't have the control to do this, there are other use models that you might think. There's a great self-reflection course that an individual can do all by themselves, and some great guides on how to use video for the purposes of self-reflection that's available as well, and lots more to come. Well, Angela, thank you so much for all of the work. I know how much work you put into this course.
Thank you.
And I really appreciate it, and for taking the time to talk with us this evening. And thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. It was great to spend a Sunday evening doing this with everyone.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Y'all have a great evening. Bye.
Bye, guys.